started and out of here at about the usual time, I'm going to get started. So what I've chosen to do, and I think I've got that written down, but I'll say it to put you in the right. Como dice San Ignacio, ¿cómo es San Ignacio? No la contemplación, cuando empieza una meditación. Composición del lugar. Para hacer una composición, to get you situated here, what I decided to do, for better or worse, was not to give you a summary that I, wrote, because first of all, that would take more work. Two, it implies that maybe you don't have to read it. And my encouragement, my message is that you should read it, okay? That everyone should read. When I started working at the age of, I started at 11, but as a professional, after college, I would read every letter that came from the president of the company. There weren't that many, but whatever letter came from the president of the company, as a 21-year-old startup, I would read his letters. When I had the good fortune to be president myself, I expected the employees to read my letters. So here we have the president, of course, is called the Pope of our faith, and we should read what he sends out. So here we go. So what I chose to do, I didn't explain, was to pick out of you'll see 120-some paragraphs, pick out a bunch of them to try to give you a flavor, maybe, and also explain the format of the document, chapters and subtitles, so that maybe something catches your eye and tempts you to go ahead and read the document, which in uncharacteristic fashion for Pope Francis is not all that long, okay? So anyway, this exhortation, the Lexite, was based on an unfinished Pope Francis work that Pope Leo XIV made his own, adding some reflections, just as Francis did with Benedict XIV's encyclical Lumen Dei. It is a little awkward for one doesn't know when Francis is referring to himself in the third person and when Leo is the one that's referring to him. Nevertheless, we don't wonder about the intention of either pope, particularly Francis, who so cared for the poor and subscribed to his one-time Jesuit Superior General Pedro Arrupe's coined term, I believe it was coined to him, by him, the church preferential option for the poor. And we know that Pope Leo is striving for unity among factions within the church today, so I'm sure he stuck to the document that he got and made minimal changes. That's my opinion. I will try to differentiate between what Pope Francis wrote, mostly Pope Francis, and my notations, which are very few, and only the things that that moved me, generally in a negative way, I have to say, but not too many, and I will make a distinction. So that's what that is. Okay, so it is good to point out that this is essentially a teaching document to exhort us to deeper evangelical life. But again, there are higher levels of church authority than an apostolic exhortation, as you can see there. I would, and I wanted to point that out. The first thought that occurred to me as I was preparing, which is the first time I've done this with a Pope's document, is to put myself in his place, and I said to myself, boy, it would be very hard to write to over a quarter of the world's population who are in such disparaging physical and spiritual conditions. But then, at the end of the day, he's writing to each of us, and salvation is a personal matter. Hence, we must pray and meditate on what it says to me, and to you. For example, at my first confession and spiritual direction during my first spiritual exercises at age 55, I expressed after my confession to the confessor and spiritual director my plans to volunteer. I had retired at that age, and I commented to the confessor that I had plans to volunteer with the Sisters of Charity and with the homeless group of my parish. The advice I received from him, I would later learn, because I didn't know much of the ACU at the time, I think that was in keeping with our founder's clear teaching that God gives each one of us a purpose that only we, only one, and only one, you, can identify and live up to. And his advice to me was to leave the service to the poor to others. Not because he was disparaging the poor, but because he was saying to me that you may have been picked, you need to search what it is that you were asked to do and that only you can do. A Vatican news, so here you have pretty much how I'm going to go through. It's only 5 of these slides, although I have many more slides, but basically you can see that the book was written in an introduction in 5 chapters. I will go through each chapter, and I will list on here the subheadings in each chapter, and I will pick then selections from the document to read out to you. So here I start, and a Vatican news contributor points out that in this exhortation, Pope Leo situated himself firmly on the path laid out by his predecessors, including St. John the 23rd, with his appeal to wealthier countries in mater e magistra, not to remain indifferent to nations oppressed by hunger and extreme poverty. St. Paul VI added his own voice with Populorum Progressio and his appearance at the United Nations as an advocate of the poor, as did St. John Paul II, who consolidated the doctrinal foundations of the Church preferential option for the poor. More recently, Benedict XVI in Caritas in Veritate offered a more markedly political take on the crisis of the third millennium, while Francis made care for the poor and solidarity with the poor one of the key themes of his pontificate. So now, going to each point and the selected reading. Love of the Lord, then, is one with love for the poor. This is not a matter of mere human kindness, but a revelation. Contact with those who are lowly and powerless is a fundamental way of encountering the Lord of history. In the poor, he continues to speak to us. He then turns to St. Francis and says, our recently departed Pope, explaining his choice of Francis as his pontifical name, sorry, this is an observation probably by Pope Leo. Our recently departed Pope, explaining his choice of Francis as his pontifical name, related how after his selection, a cardinal friend of his embraced him, kissed him, and told him, do not forget the poor. It is the same appeal that the leaders of the church made to St. Paul when he went up to Jerusalem to confirm his mission. St. Francis, the Pope tells us, prompted an evangelical renewal in Christians and society of his time. A further step on the same path was taken by the Second Vatican Council, as St. Paul VI pointed out when he said that the ancient parable of the Samaritan served as the model for the Council's spirituality. Now as to the cry of the poor. In fact, there are many forms of poverty. The poverty of those who lack material means of subsistence, the poverty of those who are socially marginalized and lack the means to give voice to their dignity and abilities, moral and spiritual poverty, cultural poverty, the poverty of those who find themselves in a condition of personal or social weakness or fragility, the poverty of those who have no rights, no space, no freedom. the highest condition of personal weakness or fragility, and the leading cause of national. I left something out here. This is not my observation, okay? I was maybe not surprised, but unhappy that in terms of all the various elements of possible poorness, abortion is not mentioned as one of them. I don't know of another condition which is more of personal weakness or fragility, and that also happens to be the leading cause of unnatural death in the world. Back to the document. The cry of the poor. In hearing the cry of the poor, we are asked to enter into the heart of God, who is always concerned for the needs of his children, especially those in greatest need. At the same time, we should perhaps speak more correctly of the many faces of the poor and of poverty, since it is a multifaceted phenomenon. A concrete commitment to the poor must also be accompanied by a change in mentality that can have an impact at the cultural level. In fact, the illusion of happiness derived from a comfortable life pushes many people towards a vision of life centered on the accumulation of wealth and social success at all costs, even at the expense of others and by taking advantage of unjust social ideals and political economic systems that favor the strongest. Thus, in a world where the poor are increasingly numerous, we paradoxically see the growth of a wealthy elite living in a bubble of comfort and luxury, almost in another world compared to ordinary people. This means that a culture still persists, sometimes well disguised, that discards others without even realizing it and tolerates with indifference that millions of people die of hunger or survive in conditions unfit for human beings. Here, back to me for a second. I note that Thomas Malthus was an influential economist, cleric, and scholar, but he was also dead wrong in his projections of a world population growing exponentially and a food supply growing arithmetically. Pope Francis seemed to have a predisposition against the forces of industrial revolution, capitalism, and freedom. In all fairness, Pope Francis used to append the adjective savage. He would say savage capitalism. I also note that he favored the UN and a world government. He seemed oblivious, it seemed to me, to correlations between the Industrial Revolution that I mentioned, the emergent capitalism of the time, and the growing freedom around the world, which I consider the major causes for the reduction of poverty throughout the world. Moving to the second chapter now, or is it the first? Yeah, the second chapter. The choice of the poor. God is merciful love, and his plan of love, which unfolds and is fulfilled in history, is above all his descent and coming among us to free us from slavery, fear, sin, and the power of death. It is in this perspective that we can understand the numerous pages of the Old Testament in which God is presented as the friend and liberator of the poor, the one who hears the cry of the poor and intervenes to free them. Now to Jesus, the poor Messiah. It becomes clear then that our faith in Christ, who became poor and was always close to the poor and the outcast, is the basis of our concern for the integral development of society's most neglected members. As to mercy toward the poor in the Bible, Pope Francis cites Old and New Testament passages to support his observation. In this chapter, the longest portion of the exhortation, Pope Francis reviews the history of the church focus on the poor. It is quite long and too numerous to go over, in the time allotted, so I'll just give you a moment to skim the slide, and I'm going to jump to the last point on it, which has to do with popular movements, where he says, popular movements invite us to overcome the idea of social policies being a policy for the poor, but never with the poor and never of the poor, much less part of a project which can bring people together. Because I happen to be writing a booklet on the ACU of Cuba, I portray here the heralded example of ACU's social apostolate in Cuba. You can read them there. By the way, the most notable effort, that at the poorest neighborhood of Havana called Las Yaguas, was an initiative undertaken at the request of the Bishop of Havana at that time and accepted by, obviously accepted by Father Felipe Rey de Castro. But it should also be noted that the second, and actually the first reason why the ACU was heralded as a model for the world had to do with the rather proportionately large number of priests that came through the ACU and became, and took on their clerical status. It should also be said that, well, there's half the slide is missing. I see it all here, but I only see half. There's another half to that page. I should say that out of this 40, they're not all here, all 40 of them. But in 1953, the ACU had 495 sodalists. 175 of them were still students. 40 in 1953, ACU started in 1931, were already priests. I should say 2 of those became bishops. If you take 40 and divide it by only the professionals, not the students, but only the professionals out of that 495, I guess it's 320, 40, you get 13% of the graduated professionals became priests that went through the ACU. As a point of reference, I checked how many priests are in the world today, in the Catholic world, how many Catholics are in total in the world. You saw the figure earlier, just over 2 billion people. You come up with a number of not 13%, but 0.13%, which means that there was a ratio of 100 to 1. The ACU would produce priests, like Father Rafael here, at a rate 100 times greater than the society, than the Catholic family, to use today's homily word, would imply. That was the reason number 1, cited by the Superior General of the Jesuit Society in 1953, documented in a letter that he sent to the president of the ACU at the time, Jorge Casteleiro. Now, not to leave out, yes, sir.
The pictures of those priests?
Yes.
What's the time frame? I mean, is that?
Those are all the priests those are all the ACU sororists who went from being students and went to the ACU and then became priests. So 1931 to 1953 is a 20-year period.
So you're missing there a little. Okay.
I'm missing half the chart. I know not all 40 are there. I think they're like 34 there, or some number less than 40. You always have that. You don't have pictures of everybody when you do.
But if you had it updated until 2025, obviamente it will be.
There will be more. There will be more, but not at this rate. I have looked at it with the help of Casicedo. We have identified, and I've shown that before, how many came on afterwards. I mean, Rafael was one of them, okay, that came afterwards. Well, he was here. But this is the story of the Cuba. That's why I'm writing about that particular those years, 1931 to 1961, of the Agrupación. Now, to be fair, today's agrupados, and we already touched upon this. In fact, Mariano stole one of my points here. But today's agrupados are called, just like the bishop called the Agrupación to serve the poor of this neighborhood, today's agrupado are called to serve in a special way by Bishop Thomas Wensky, who called us to serve. In the year 2000, he gave us a video hearing, and out of that, you can read, what is his very words regarding to what he thinks, about the ACU. And that's just, his direction, that the ACU should go after the universities. But I'm leaving out of here the fact that there are many, many agrupados who serve in all those movements, all those other movements that the Archdiocese has, like Jorge in Camino and Gumercindo in the prison ministry, and on and on and on. No, you're here. I hope I can say this. You were the one who told me. I'm going to say it on the radio, on the whatever this is, on internet. But and maybe the bishop says this to everybody. Okay, let's be humble. But the bishop said, agrupados make up the pillars of the Archdiocese of Miami. Agrupados throughout the Archdiocese are the pillars of. But he might say that to all the groups, okay? But he did say it to us, and I learned that from Pablito. So, by the way, today's agrupados are to serve in that way. I don't know if you know, I learned this from Rosa Mística, which was the female group that also had vocations to religious life. That when Father Llorente arrived here in 1961, there was only one university. That was the University of Florida. And of course, Father Llorente was the perfect, the Holy Spirit picked the perfect person to replace Father Rey de Castro. In fact, Frank Salas, I'm getting off the script here, but I find this interesting. Frank Salas would tell me on more than one occasion Father Rey de Castro would not have succeeded in America. He would not. He didn't speak English. He didn't have the right character for that. And Frank thinks the highest of Father Felipe Rey de Castro. But Llorente was clearly the right person who gave an oath to follow the Agrupación until the end of his life. It was a covenant. He made a covenant with the Agrupación, as did Rey de Castro, a covenant with the Agrupación for life. And he fulfilled it. But when he got here, because he was following Father Rey de Castro's vision, he went to the first Archbishop of Miami, had just been named a year before, and said that he wanted to introduce himself, and he would see his credentials and so on. And he said, we want to get located right in front of University of Miami. And let me get back to script here. And Miami's first Archbishop, which I think was Carroll, is that right? Or Carroll. Out of prudence, I'm sure, not with any malice, but out of prudence, I'm sure we were talking about the second invasion already at that time, which never happened, and young people making, racing, whatever. This is my supposition, okay? So it was only recently, again, as I said, that in Miami, we returned to the universities with the blessing of our Archbishop. But let me get back to the exhortation with that little aside. In this chapter, we picked the points, and he goes over bringing up to date what has happened from the previous two chapters where he talked about the Old Testament and the New Testament. He talks about the century, basically 19th century and the century of the 19th century and into the 20th century of the church social doctrine. Charity has the power to change reality, says Pope Francis. It is a genuine force for change in history. It is the source that must inspire and guide every effort to resolve the structural causes of poverty, and to do so with urgency. As the structure of sin that create poverty and extreme inequality, we must continue then, he says, to denounce the dictatorship of an economy that kills, and to recognize that while the earnings of a minority are growing exponentially, so too is the gap separating the majority from the prosperity enjoyed by those happy few. This imbalance, here again, when he's writing to 2.5 billion people, who is he putting in? I don't know who he's putting in that elite category. He said Elon Musk and the guy from Amazon. Is he putting there North Americans? I don't know what goes into. Again, we have to put that aside and say, what does this say to me? Because we can't be sure. But he says, this imbalance, yes. This imbalance is the result of ideologies that defend the absolute autonomy of the marketplace and financial speculation. Consequently, they reject the right of states charged with vigilance for the common good to exercise any form of control. Does that apply to the United States? We have no control? I would disagree, but let's leave it for later.
It's an oversimplification.
Yeah.
But it follows the regular narrative.
Yeah, I agree. A new tyranny is being born, invisible and often virtual, which unilaterally and relentlessly imposes its own laws and rules. There is no shortage of theories attempting to justify the present state of affairs or to explain that economic thinking requires us to wait for invisible market forces to resolve everything. Nevertheless, the dignity of every human person must be respected today, not tomorrow, and the extreme poverty of all those to whom this dignity is denied should constantly weigh upon our consciences. So here again, I note, by omission, a disparagement of the progress that freedom and capitalism has brought to the reduction of poverty of all kinds. The poor as subjects. In light of this, it is evident that all of us must let ourselves be evangelized by the poor and acknowledge the mysterious wisdom which God wishes to share with us through them. No Christian can regard the poor simply as a societal problem. They are part of our family. They are one of us. Nor can our relationship to the poor be reduced to merely another ecclesial activity or function. In the words of the Aparecida document, we are asked to devote time to the poor, to give them loving attention, to listen to them with interest, to stand by them in difficult moments, choosing to spend hours, weeks, or years of our lives with them, and striving to transform their situations, starting from them. We cannot forget, Pope Francis says, that this is what Jesus himself proposed in his actions and by his words. I don't know, I may have not have advanced the slide here. Okay. I may be out of sync here, but let me continue. There are those, I'm almost close to the end. There are those who say our task is to pray and teach sound doctrine. Separated this religious aspect from integral development, they even say that it is the government's job to care for them, or that it would be better not to lift them out of their poverty, but simply to teach them to work. At times, pseudo-scientific data are invoked to support the claim that a free market economy will automatically solve the problem of poverty, or even that we should opt for pastoral work with the so-called elite, since rather than wasting time on the poor, it would be better to care for the rich, the influential and professionals, so that with their help, real solutions can be found and the church can be protected. It is easy to perceive the worldliness behind these positions, which will lead us to view reality through superficial lenses, lacking any light from above, and to cultivate relationships that bring us security and a position of privilege. reading this apostolic exhortation leads me to believe that Pope Francis does not agree with the spiritual director that first counseled me. May God and Pope Francis forgive me, but I am inclined to believe that this, oh, did I read the right part? No, let me tell you, there is a paragraph here, and I hope I didn't skip it. Oh my God, it's very important. It was at the very end of the document where, it's only 121 and it's like 114 or 15. Maybe I read this and I was just reading, you guys may have heard me say. It says in this document that the best way to help a poor person is to give him a job, is to have him work, which is kind of comes at the end of all this. And you say, we have gone to 125 paragraphs, and that never it comes up at the very end. So my supposition is that's one thing that came from Pope Leo. I may not have been their original document, but of course I don't know. Yeah, I didn't do a good job here. Maybe this is the quote here. Anyway, here's, I take some issue with how the history of the world over 2,000 years has transpired. And this, maybe you would call this pseudo-history or pseudo-economic analysis. But this sort of thing feels right to me. I just went into the internet and found a source that addressed the issue of what has happened. I mean, this has been in the news for the last 10 years, that poverty is taking it worldwide. This is extreme poverty. That extreme poverty is taking a worldwide drop, an unbelievable drop. It started obviously with the Industrial Revolution, but it's picked up since 1980 because of all the improvements over time and the fact that Malthus was wrong. Food growth can grow exponentially and not just arithmetically, for one. And then all other improvements, the only one I would like to point out here, because it's one dear to my heart. As I told you, as we made our prayers, that I'm so happy to have come here at the age of 11 to a free country. And we can see what is happening in that same period of the Industrial Revolution, at the same time as the Industrial Revolution, that brought the increase in freedom around the world. And there's still a long way to go. Now, having said that, there's no question that I'm not trying to minimize. I don't want to make the same mistake that I think Pope Francis makes to say that we don't have a poverty problem. Obviously, we do. One poor person is a problem, and it's a serious problem. So that I firmly believe that. But I think that he misrepresents what this economy that he doesn't like. He made it very clear. In fact, with this I'll finish. I read a book, it's a huge tome, by a Spanish priest out of Toledo, which is entitled From Rome to Berlin, the protestatization, en español sale mejor, la protestatización de la Iglesia Católica. And he calls, our dear Pope Francis, el Papa Peronista.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anyway, so that's. I hope you're encouraged to read it yourself. It's not that long. I think he covered everything. He went through history. He went through I couldn't cover everything that he does, but. I hope it was useful to you. If there are any comments or beyond Benny's comment, anything else you want to ask him?
You can't expect the guy grew up in that.
Yeah,
you can't expect, he sees the world different than we do.
Yeah.
Or did.
Yeah, let me address that very point. I had it at one time, but took it out.
I mean, it's not that he's right or wrong. He just has a different lens that he uses, and that lens is his experience, his growing up, just like we look at things through our own growing up and our own experience. You cannot expect someone from Mexico who crossed the border, lives in El Paso, okay, since we were talking about that tonight, even if he or she is legal, okay, you can't expect them to see the world the way we did when we came here legally, okay, with waiver visas or paroles, okay, that eventually led to residency and citizenship. It's a different background. They see it differently. And the problem that we have is that all these smart people want to generalize. And there's only one way to do this. There's only one way to cure poverty. One person at a time. When you throw money at it, it doesn't work.
Let me just say that to your point, because I was going to touch upon that, but Pope Francis grew up as a teenager, right? From his teens to his early 20s under the 11-year presidency of Juan Perón. And on top of that, he then lived in a country which I remember because I married an Argentinian and I used to follow it, which was ranked amongst the most corrupt in the world for many years. I remember even reading a year, that's the one that struck me, they were number one in the world in corruption. So that's the environment he grew up in. On the other hand, you have to say this, Bernie, on the other hand, maybe half the world is still living in that environment, okay? Not us, but half the world is still living in that environment. But he seems to be, our Pope seems to be oblivious to the fact that it's not that the people that like capitalism are bad people, because the capitalism is neither good nor bad. It's just a thing, you know.
Are you talking about Leo the 14th or are you talking about Francis?
No, I'm talking about Francis. I'm talking about Francis. I withhold judgment on Leo because we just took.
You can't generalize that way. You have to look. The church has been through, and I'm surprised it survived, but the church has been through a very, very difficult time since the 1960s. And all the popes since the 1960s up until Francis have tried to kind of control the deluge. And they did a pretty good job. Francis, I think, opened it up again. Leo the 14th, yet to be seen. Okay? He doesn't say much. Okay? And part of the problem is that, you cannot discount, just like in any corporation, you have the CEO, and then you have a bunch of people around him that he allows to make decisions, and basically, he, for the most part, not all of them, but for the most part, he signs off on them. Same thing happens in the church. And who are the people who are in the church bureaucracy, whether it's local or international right now? They're people from the 60s. They still have that Vietnam War mentality. We have to get over that. That's why we have not, I don't want to get into politics. That's why we have not gotten over that. We need to get new blood, and we can only do it one person at a time. One person at a time. One person at a time.
Ok. Yo quiero cambiar un poco el tema. Voy a hablar en español. Jesucristo, cuando Judas estaba protestando porque lo estaban perfumando, dijo, déjala, los pobres siempre van a estar con ustedes. Entonces, la pobreza, mientras el ser humano esté en la condición de pecado, no tiene solución. Y el que diga que lo tenga, corre, no le hagas caso, porque si Jesucristo dijo que siempre los pobres van a estar siempre. Eso no tiene, la pobreza no tiene solución. Ahora, los pobres están ahí para nuestra salvación. Y nosotros tenemos que tratar a nuestro nivel de ayudar a los pobres. Ahora, repito, si alguien dice que tiene la solución para la pobreza, corre. Esos son los marxistas, ya sabemos cómo termina todo, caótico, son un bando de ladrones, todo al final. Y más o menos todo el que viene con esa onda está robando de una manera o de otra. O sea, vamos a hablar de la pobreza como una oportunidad que Dios nos da para salvarnos. Que la vamos a resolver completa, imposible. Y esa es,
Oye, déjame hacer un comentario, porque ahora me di cuenta, no sé qué pasó, pero debo decir la palabra que más aparece, no aparece 10 veces en eso, pero la palabra que más aparece en el documento es la igualdad, equality, okay? And that's a really bad word for me. Never equity, but always equality. And like you said, where in nature is there equality? There is no example in nature of equality. There isn't such a thing. He made us all different. If we weren't different, we couldn't help each other. You need to be, this is an economic fact. You and I cannot help each other if we have exactly the same skills. Because I can do what you can do. I don't need you. But when we're unequal, you have something that I can do, and I have something that you can't do. Let's use it, I'm going to make this off the top of my head. At the top of my head. At the top of my head, the poor can help us be saved, and we can bring the poor out of poverty. So that's one way that works. If we were all the same, we couldn't help each other. There would be no point. And in the wild, there is no equality. One animal eats another, is stronger than the other. Anyway, go ahead.
No, Efraín, gracias por la presentación.
No, por nada. I hope it was
Looking forward to reading the
worthwhile.
document.
Good.
Yo creo que, vaya, Santa Teresa de Calcuta,
She's mentioned, of course.
que tú mencionaste, dice, don't worry about, solving the problems of the world. Hay personas que están encargadas con eso, no estamos en este salón. Feed one person at a time. Y como dijiste, Camacho, ese es el problema el desamparado que tú ves, la persona que tú puedes aconsejar, ayudar, hazlo. Y ver a Jesucristo en la cara de esa persona,
Sí.
muchas veces, como dijo, the distressing disguise of the poor.
voy a reafirmar algo que dijiste. Todos nosotros aquí, en la casa, tenemos primero una casa. De una manera o de otra, préstamos bancarios, lo que sea. Bien. Tenemos agua caliente, agua fría. Tenemos comida, tenemos Nosotros vivimos con más confort, todos nosotros. 95% de las personas en Miami, aunque sea en un apartamento, vive con más confort que cualquier rey europeo en el 1900. Definitivamente, eso es. O sea, nosotros, pero lo mismo, hay una gran clase media en México, que yo lo he conocido, en cualquier lugar menos en Cuba. Y en Haití, vaya, hay excepciones.
La hubo en Cuba.
La hubo en Cuba, pero lo que te quiero decir es que nosotros, o sea, el nivel de vida mundialmente y el globalismo, aunque no nos guste, ha ayudado a eso. O sea, desde el punto de vista que la manufactura, la creación de riquezas, se ha mudado incluso a China, vaya.
Es el mercado libre, es parte de la libertad,
Claro.
es el mercado libre que hay.
Entonces India, por ejemplo, India está pronosticado que sale del tercer mundo en el año 2050, si sigue al ritmo que va, o sea. Y entonces, eso es una cosa que impensable a principios del siglo pasado. Entonces, o sea, el capitalismo es bueno, básicamente es bueno. Y el socialismo es intrínsecamente perverso.
No hay un caso en el mundo, y han habido ya seguro que más de 2 docenas de ejemplos, todos han fracasado, sin excepción. Entonces, el socialismo es un camino hacia el comunismo. Eso lo han explicado muy claramente. Eso es un paso, no son cosas diferentes, es lo mismo, pero que llega...
Mira, yo estudié,
Mira, te doy un ejemplo.
Están equivocados ahí. El socialismo, el comunismo, es una excusa para tener a los demás subyugados, pobres, miserables, y tener a la gente del poder arriba. Esas dos palabras no sirven, no existen. Así como lo quieren poner ustedes con definiciones, no existe una definición de ese tipo para ellos. ¿Me entiendes? En mi
Bueno,
opinión.
No entendí,
mira,
no
Tú
entendí.
lo has vivido porque tú eres cubano.
Mira, yo lo viví 28 años y yo fui a la universidad en Cuba 5 años y en todos los semestres de la universidad tuve que estudiar una asignatura de marxismo. O sea, de marxismo.
De marxismo.
O sea, yo conozco el marxismo en teoría. O sea, el socialismo, según Marx y Engels, es la transición, el periodo de transición del capitalismo al comunismo. Y explícitamente ellos dicen que la violencia está justificada. Eso está en los manuales comunistas, en los manuales marxistas. Entonces, socialismo intrínsecamente perverso.
Es un camino, sí, está en camino.
Yo voy a hablar basura, pero acuérdate que, bueno, pero es que hay veces que hay que hablar basura para que entonces cuando la basura se revuelve, se saca lo bueno, porque lo bueno siempre va hacia arriba, lo malo se queda abajo. ¿Entiendes? Entonces, todas estas cosas, por ejemplo, y aquí tenemos un experto, vamos a poner la doctrina social de la Iglesia. Si lo leemos, tiene mucho sentido, es muy correcto, pero es que eso fue una respuesta a un mal que estaba ocurriendo en ese momento que se parecía a la doctrina social de la Iglesia. Y lo que ha pasado desde
¿Qué tú dices? ¿Marxismo?
Claro, y lo que ha pasado desde esa época, ahora tenemos gente que utiliza la doctrina social de la Iglesia para cambiarla y acercarla más al marxismo. En otras palabras, es lo que hace el mal espíritu constantemente. El rey de la mentira se te acerca con una cosa que suena bien, pero en realidad es mala. Entonces hay que tener mucho cuidado. Entonces, eso está en todos los lugares, en todas las familias, en todos los países, en la iglesia, en todos los lugares. Y hay que tener cuidado.
Regresando al documento, yo pienso que esas 3 o 4 cosas que yo mencioné, la igualdad y el capitalismo salvaje y todas esas cosas, se podía haber dejado fuera del documento y hubiera estado para mí perfecto, pero no se puede aguantar.
Mira, ya no voy a hablar más. Lo prometo que después de esto no voy a hablar más. En la iglesia tenemos que tener muchísimo cuidado. Porque la ideología se nos está metiendo. Por ejemplo, cuando alguien dice, ¿cuál es el papel de la mujer en la iglesia? En la iglesia no hay papeles. En la iglesia hay vocaciones. Y cuando uno para de ver las cosas de la iglesia como iglesia, mándate a correr. O sea, en la iglesia tenemos vocaciones. Y entonces las vocaciones tienen sus condiciones. O sea, para ser, la Biblia, para ser obispo casado con una sola mujer, ya sabemos la historia después, célibe, pero bueno, esto y esto. Para ser sacerdote, esto y esto. Para ser diácono, esto y esto. O sea, es una vocación, no es problema de papel. Ya cuando uno habla de papel es ideología, ahí directo a la vena. Y caer en eso sería malísimo. Y no voy a hablar más.
Quiero recordarle que nuestro Señor Jesucristo dijo, a los pobres siempre los van a tener. O sea que olvídense, hablen todo lo que quieran, comunismo, socialismo, whatever, no importa qué inventen, siempre va a haber pobres. O sea, la respuesta entonces es qué vamos a hacer nosotros individualmente con cada uno de ellos.
Oye, yo tenía, era una bobería mía, pero iba a empezar esto con esto a los 65 años, pero que yo llevo en este país, pero cuando me preparé ahí me di cuenta que iba a ser muy largo y lo quité. Pero esto empezaba con una foto mío de 10 años en los tabureques esos de las competencias de natación. Estaba yo en segundo lugar, Fidelito en el número 1 y un muchacho, Pereira, algo así, Pereira, en el tercer lugar. Hasta hoy día yo estoy seguro que yo gané, ¿comprende? Yo estoy seguro que yo gané, pero me hicieron un cuento y que él tocó la pared antes que tú estabas delante de él, pero él fue más inteligente que tú y tiró la mano y te tocó y lo vieron primero a él. Uso ese ejemplo porque lo iba a introducir acá y decir, nos enfocamos mucho en la pobreza material, pero Madre Teresa, y no tiene que ser Madre Teresa, todos estamos de acuerdo en eso, la peor pobreza es la espiritual, Entonces, esa es la más importante y nos olvidamos hablar de eso y ahí se podía haber profundizado mucho. Pero bueno, yo iba a decir que Fidelito, pobre, no recibió era muy pobre espiritualmente y como ustedes saben, terminó